Hi, welcome to my lecture series on evaluating science in the media. In this talk, I'm going to be discussing how understanding the nature of science impacts how people evaluate science in the media. And I'm going to be discussing two perspectives on the nature of science. The first is science as consensus, or a consensus view on the nature of science, and then I'll be talking about the family resemblance approach to the nature of science. I'd like to return briefly to this idea that understanding science in the media occurs at the intersection of science literacy and media literacy. And this is an idea I presented previously, that people evaluate science in the news. Sometimes people accept the scientific information they see in the news because they regard science as credible, as authoritative. Perhaps they have beliefs that the media reflect science accurately, completely, and truthfully. When audiences accept the information they encounter in the news, they are taking a deferential approach. They defer to scientific authority. They defer to those representations. Another source of evaluation, though, is the prior orientations that audiences have when they encounter news. These are the prior beliefs, perhaps value orientations, things that affect their evaluation. And sometimes people rely on their prior orientations to evaluate scientific issues, and they will disregard or perhaps ignore or even reject the scientific information they encounter in the news. When they do that, they are employing a dominant stance where their prior orientations dominate their evaluation. Ideally, when people encounter science in the news, they will reflect on their prior understanding, their prior orientation, and think about how this new information they're encountering in the news relates with what they already know, taking a more critical stance. Now, that critical stance benefits certainly from having science literacy, understanding how science works, how science is conducted, and so on, and also from having media literacy, understanding how media systems work, how the media represent certain ideas, the limitations or constraints that media actors face. And those two factors really affect how individuals engage in more critical appraisals of science in the media. I'd like to spend a little more time talking about science literacy, and I'd like to discuss it in terms of the nature of science, and specifically what people understand about the nature of science. Understanding the nature of science reflects beliefs about how science develops, how science progresses, and how ideas and new scientific knowledge emerge. And these beliefs can affect how people interpret science information when they encounter it. According to Kishvi, a person's understanding about the epistemology of content knowledge will influence the application of the content knowledge. In other words, nature of science conceptualizations affect the interpretations of science knowledge upon which decisions about socio-scientific issues are made. So people who have a particular understanding of the nature of science will interpret science with respect to how it is relevant to them and also the value it has in society. And those interpretations will affect how they respond to that scientific information, how it affects their beliefs, how it affects their values, how it affects their judgments and perhaps even decisions. Now, Kishvi was interested in how understanding the nature of science affects people's interpretations and evaluations of scientific information. She conducted an experiment on secondary school students where half of them took a 4-week course on genetic engineering. The other half took the same 4-week course, but they also took specific modules on the nature of science. And in those specific modules, they received instruction that scientific knowledge is tentative. In other words, that the current scientific understanding of a phenomenon is only correct until new knowledge emerges, until a new perspective emerges based on science. Scientific knowledge is empirical in that it requires observations to make claims about a phenomenon. It is inferential in that the conclusions drawn about a phenomenon are based on interpretation of the observations. It's creative in that theory development and thinking about how to test hypotheses requires some creative thought, coming up with new ideas. And finally, science is subjective in that each scientist has their own perspective, their own way of creating new theories, coming up with novel ways to test hypotheses, drawing inferences, and even making observations. There is some subjectivity. So the students took these courses, and 4 weeks later some observations were made. Unsurprisingly, those who took the course on the nature of science had a better understanding of the nature of science as it was defined in this study. The students were also asked to state their opinion whether they favor or oppose testing of genetically modified crops. Now, the two groups of students didn't differ in the nature of their opinion, but where they did differ was their explanations or their reasons for that decision. Those who had taken the course on the nature of science gave more complete explanations. There were many more specific reasons for their decision. And this is interesting. Although the opinions weren't different between the two groups, those who had studied the nature of science could really explain why they made that decision. And their decision was based on a more thorough logical reasoning. And so this just shows that teaching about the nature of science can really affect how people form their opinions and how well they understand the reasons for their opinions. Now, the model of the nature of science that was used in that experiment reflects a consensus view, and Erzik and Nola were a bit critical of this view. The model used in Kishfi's study, of course, was that science is tentative, empirical, inferential, subjective, and creative, right? And they regard that as the consensus view, and their criticism was first that it focuses pretty much only on epistemology, the way things are known. It has to do with the nature of knowledge. What makes it the consensus view is that it is the least controversial definition of what science is. Most scientists would agree with that characterization of the nature of science. But that characterization has limited breadth, right? It doesn't really cover all of the different aspects that a scientific discipline can have. And because of that, because it's so narrow, it's rather prescriptive. And Erzik and Nola gave the example of the definition of a triangle. So what is a triangle? Well, a straightforward definition is that a triangle is a closed plane figure with 3 straight sides. People who have studied geometry would probably agree with that definition. There would be consensus about that definition. And such a narrow and prescriptive definition is appropriate to describing a triangle because a triangle is a fairly simple concept. Is it fair to apply a similarly prescriptive consensus view of science? Well, Erzik and Nola said no. Although the consensus view is accurate, it is insufficient given the nature of science. And they give the example of defining what is a game. I've had conversations with friends about what is a game, specifically how is a game different from a sport. But in that discussion, we talk about what defines a game, and there are lots of questions to be asked. What type of game is being played? Is it a ball game? Is it a card game? Is it a mind game? Those are all different types of games. What are the rules? Games typically have some sort of set of rules or procedures to follow that establish its nature as a game. Who plays? Some games are individual, some games are in small groups, some games involve many, many people. But what all games have in common is that they are indeed games. Any two games might be very different from each other in many, many respects, but they might share 1 or 2 features in common that clearly align them with the concept of a game. And so they aren't games because they satisfy a particular consensus view. They are games because they share some similarities with each other that are consistent with the concept of a game. And so Erzik and Nola take this idea to define a family resemblance approach to explaining the nature of science. And so just to give an example, you can imagine a couple parents with these characteristics, A, B, C, and D, E, F, and then they have offspring with various combinations of those characteristics. A, B, D, C, D, F, B, C, E, A, E, F. And even though each of those 4 offspring are different from the others, no 2 of those offspring are the same, it is clear that they come from the same family. It is clear they share something in common, and that common characteristic is the family of which they are a part, and that can be known through understanding and comparing their characteristics. And so Erzik and Nola apply this to explaining the nature of science, where there are many different scientific disciplines that, while superficially they may appear to be different, they do have some common characteristics that make them scientific. And so they give some examples in scientific methods. For example, all sciences involve observation, but some of them are essentially limited to making only observations and drawing conclusions on the basis of those observations, like astronomy. There are not experiments in the formation of stars, right? Astronomers observe stars, they develop mathematical models to explain how stars work, and then they test those models by making more observations. They are mostly limited to observations. Similar phenomenon in volcanology. Scientists don't do experiments on what causes volcanoes to erupt. They don't manipulate the Earth's mantle. They observe volcanoes, they observe the Earth's mantle, they develop models to explain volcanic activity, and then they test those models by making more observations. Similarly with anthropology, it's observing human society and how society progresses, and it's largely observational. Now these are three fairly different sciences. I would say these are three rather distinct disciplines, yet they are all scientific for at least this reason, that observation is the basis of scientific claims. A number of other scientific disciplines use experimentation, like psychology. There are experiments to test how people react in their mind to different stimuli or different situations. Same with chemistry. Chemistry involves mixing different chemicals and seeing the outcome. Medicine involves applying different medical treatments and testing the outcome. Now, psychology, chemistry, and medicine are all very different areas of science, but they are all science because, in part, of the way they go about creating new knowledge. Now, Erzik and Nola defined 4 different aspects of the family resemblance approach to the nature of science. First, the nature of science is concerned with scientific activities, like what is observed and how it is observed. So you can compare, for example, cosmology and psychology. Cosmology is the study of what the universe is made of, how it came to be, where it will go in the future. It's a large macro view of the universe. Psychology, of course, is the study of the mind. Now, both of them are concerned with observations, yet they make very different observations, and they use very different tools to make those observations, looking out into the cosmos versus somehow trying to decipher how brain activity correlates with human thoughts. Of course, there are other similarities. Some cosmologists and some psychologists use fairly advanced instrumentation to make observations about phenomena that can't be observed directly. Aims and values are another component of the definition of the family resemblance approach. So science in general is concerned with making predictions about phenomena or explaining phenomena, but then there are different ontological orientations. So some psychologists, for example, are interested in providing an in-depth explanation of individuals or of a very small set of individuals, completely explaining their behaviors and their state of mind. That's called an idiographic explanation, providing a very complete explanation of individuals. And some scientists have developed some interesting theories on the basis of such observations. For example, Jean Piaget developing theories of schemas, mental schemas, based on observing his children. Other scientists, other psychologists are interested in developing simple models, simple theories that provide adequate explanations of a large number of people. Now, both of those approaches, the idiographic approach to explaining in very fine detail individuals versus the nomothetic approach, explanations that are simple but explain a lot of different people, those are both valid approaches. But ultimately, both approaches have the aim of providing some sort of prediction and explanation, and in providing those aims, they have value to scientists. The third aspect of the nature of science has to do with methodologies. And so scientists apply logical reasoning to draw inference about their observations. And they engage in certain rules of theorizing. These aren't strict rules in that there's a list of procedures, but there are rules in that theories arise from multiple observations, from broad patterns that are observed, and theories should provide broad explanations to phenomena within a particular domain. And these are things that the different sciences have in common, despite them going about approaches to reasoning and developing theories in fairly unique ways. And then finally, the products of science. What science produces defines the nature of science. So of course there are theories that arise, and no two theories are the same, because, well, theories shouldn't be redundant. But the purpose of those theories and the centrality of those theories to science is similar across multiple scientific disciplines. And then also the collection of data. This is something that science produces, is data sets or databases and these collections of information about things that were observed. And these can be things like large Excel spreadsheets containing lots of numeric data representing observations, or they can contain notebooks of perhaps an anthropologist who is making handwritten observations. But ultimately there are collections of data that reflect observations, and different sciences go about these data collections differently, but they all have data collections in common. And so that is the family resemblance approach, recognizing that there isn't one strict set of characteristics that define science, but rather there are these general levels of familiarity. And I introduced these two perspectives, the consensus view and the family resemblance view, because it's something I'll be discussing in my next lecture, where I talk about how understanding the nature of science affects how people evaluate scientific claims in the media. So please check out that lecture. As always, the studies I cited in this lecture are linked in the description. Thanks for watching.